Hi, 7th and 8th grade. This is actually a makeup lecture. I got an email from a parent this weekend saying that there was a section of lectures that weren't released on video, and without looking at what was missing, really, I looked at the pages and everything, and I assumed they were, it was a lecture that we had done in class um, before we went on quarantine. Just before that week, or on that week that we went into quarantine, I was out of town for the last 2 days because of fine arts. I was taking a group of kids up to Lancaster to perform and to compete. And so, honestly, that last week is kind of a blur. I tried to get everything wrapped up as much as possible before I left, but I just assumed I dropped the ball in the classroom. But then I was told that she had talked to several parents who also didn't get their children didn't get the notes. So I went back to look at what could have happened, and it's actually a lecture I recorded. It's the first one I recorded, but it looks like I deleted it. Maybe it wasn't quite right, and then I just forgot to do it, or I deleted it without realizing it. I'm honestly not sure how I messed it up so badly, but I did. I apologize. I'm sorry for the confusion. So we're going to just do a quick makeup for this one. If you already have the notes filled in, that's fine. The notes aren't required. They're there to help the students as they listen to me talk about this part of American history to focus more and to help them really understand and ingrain what they're learning. I try to use a multiple type of method in teaching, and I explain this to students when they first come to the classroom, and it's in their syllabus in the beginning of their book. I try to teach for every area of learning. So I teach by sight, which is the lectures themselves, teach by sound, which is, me doing the lectures. They also learn by writing. That's the notes. We have discussions in class that helps with the hearing and also the teaching aspect of the learning process. So I do try to envelop all of those things together. And then, of course, the reading, which is part of their homework, but they're also reading the slides. So I try to hit all of those marks as much as I can. So that's why we have the notes. They're not required. I don't grade the notes, but it's an important part of helping them to learn the material. And that being said, let me go through those notes, starting on number 49 on chapter 21. I know we're no longer in chapter 21, but this is just to make up for where I messed up. So again, I apologize for my mistake, and hopefully this will clear up the confusion. So on chapter 21, starting on number 49, I do remember talking about our first note here, singer Marian Anderson in the classroom. I believe it was like one of the last things I taught. She received many awards, including a prestigious Spring Iron Medal and the Presidential Medal of Freedom. She was probably the most famous singer of her day. In 1961, the American Institute of Public Opinion listed her as one of the world's 10 most admired women. So of all the women in the world, she was in the top 10. Her talent was obvious very, very early on, so much so that her church, when she was only 6 years old, started a trust fund for her. They put money into a bank account that she could withdraw, and it was specifically to pay for her professional training in singing. So from very early age, her talent was quite apparent, and she did not let her church down. And in fact, every time she performed, she would also perform religious songs from her church, and also would perform Negro spirituals, which was something she grew up with. And so she always made sure that she gave back to her community that way, to make sure that the contributions of Black America to American culture and music were not forgotten. By 1939, she was recognized throughout Europe as one of the greatest opera singers of the age. And please keep that in mind, that she was an opera singer. She sang classically. She didn't sing jazz. She didn't sing country or rock, which really wasn't even invented yet, or the blues. She sang opera. She sang a very formal kind of music. And because of that, she sang very professionally for her day, especially. In the same year that she was voted to be one of the most, she was one of the greatest opera singers of the age, that same year, she was scheduled to sing in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. She was denied her privilege singing at the Constitution Hall because she was Black, and she was stopped specifically by the Daughters of the American Revolution, the DAR. One of the most famous members of the DAR was the current president's wife, the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, who disagreed with the DAR's decision, and she worked with the Parks Department, I believe it was, to provide a place for Marian Anderson to sing. So instead of singing inside of Constitution Hall, Marian Anderson had the opportunity to sing at the Lincoln Memorial, which was important in a variety of ways. Lincoln was the great emancipator. He was the one who led the country in the Civil War to stop slavery. And yes, that was one of the primary causes of the Civil War. And so instead of just a few thousand people inside of Constitution Hall, 75,000 Americans showed up in this national park at the, in front of the Lincoln Memorial, and alongside the reflecting pool that reflects the Washington Memorial. They're right across from each other. 75,000 Americans of all races and walks of life were able to hear her. And also because this made the news that here one of the greatest singers in the world was denied entry into an American institution, the Constitution Hall. Radio stations and film crews showed up as well. And so she was able to reach millions of people with her voice on that Easter morning. This is what it looked like from the stage. On the stage with her are several people who were very high up in the government, who were there specifically to support Marian Anderson and her singing. The DAR did not get a good reputation from this moment. And I set it up where we could nope, didn't do it now. I did set it up where we could listen to it, to her singing. Let me see if I can try it again and get it on there. There it is. I hope you guys, oops. Let's try it again. Come on, play.
Nation's most impressive Easter demonstration. 75,000 massed before Lincoln Memorial to hear Marian Anderson, colored contralto, make her capital debut at the great Emancipator Shrine. Refusal of the DAR to let her use their hall fanned a countrywide controversy, with this great gathering as the climax. The singer was invited by Secretary of the Interior, Ickes, who attends with Secretary of the Treasury, Morgenthau. Spectators include Supreme Court Justice Black, New York Senator Robert Wagner, and a host of notables, here to listen to the voice acclaimed by many as the finest in a century.
In the 50s and 60s, Black Americans made considerable political and economic gains through the civil rights movement. This has been going on for a long time, nearly 100 years after the Civil War, where Black Americans specifically, were working really hard to get equal treatment under the law. There were constitutional amendments that were adopted into the Constitution to ensure their equal treatment, but that didn't really take place like in specific neighborhoods on the ground and in certain states. Individual states still passed a lot of laws that prohibited or limited Black rights. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruling known as the Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka called for desegregation of all public schools. This was in answer to Plessy versus Ferguson, which we have actually discussed before. In Plessy versus Ferguson, and remember, the women from Having Our Say also dealt with this issue. In Plessy versus Ferguson, it was decided by the Supreme Court that there could be segregation. Segregation was perfectly legal as long as there were separate but equal facilities. And that specifically was dealing with trains, that there could be a car specifically for white and a car for Black, as long as the cars were of equal status. In other words, as long as they were both nice, there could be separate waiting rooms. But we know from history that that didn't happen. The facilities for Black Americans were distinctly shabbier than for white Americans. And the same thing for waiting rooms, for stations, areas and stations. They were distinctly different. So even though Plessy versus Ferguson said it was okay if you had separate but equal facilities, the separate facilities, yes, that happened. Equal, no, it did not happen. In this specific case, Brown versus the Board of Education, a little girl who was 7 years old, her family moved to Topeka, Kansas, and the family went to go and register her in the local public school, and the local public school said, no, we won't have her here because she is Black. That was really against the law for one reason, because people could say, well, Plessy versus Ferguson, she should just go to a Black school. There were no Black schools available in Topeka, Kansas, so therefore that didn't apply. But the lawyers who got involved in this case were bringing this to the Supreme Court, said, okay, first of all, not only does that not apply because there are no Black schools in her neighborhood, but it also should not apply because there's not an equality in those schools and an equality of education. So the ruling, Brown versus Board of Education, got rid of that right of segregation according to the Supreme Court, and instead desegregated all public schools, because everybody pays taxes for public schools to be opened. It makes sense that everybody should be allowed to go to the public school. Okay, breaking the color barrier on the bus system in Montgomery, Alabama is going to be the next big step for the NAACP. The NAACP, remember, was they met quite often in Bessie's dentist office. She knew W.B. Du Bois very well, and she was one of his biggest fans. But this became one of the big times to break that color line was the bus system in Montgomery, Alabama. According to the Jim Crow laws that were passed in the South, Black people could ride the bus with white people. That wasn't a problem, but a Black person had to sit in the back of the bus while white people sat in the front of the bus. It was just a way of distinctly separating the color line instead of looking at everybody as human beings that needed a place to sit and a transportation to and from their jobs. It was like, we can't let people be equal. It was really adamant. Well, sometimes in a situation like this, there could be like one white person on the bus that could sit halfway through. Every person who was Black on the bus had to sit behind the white person. And sometimes people could be really rude about it and purposely make everybody sit crowded together toward the back. Well, this is one of the things. It's such a silly way of keeping people down. It's just ridiculously stupid. But this was one of the ways that the NAACP could show the rest of the United States how the color line was drawn so firmly in the South. And so the NAACP hired a woman, and I know I talked about this in class. They hired a woman to go and be in to take the bus. And she was young, she was healthy, and she was ready to get on the bus. The whole purpose was for her to get on the bus, sit on the front seat, and get arrested. That was the purpose. Just before that was supposed to happen, however, that young lady discovered that she was expecting. The NAACP did not want to put her in a position where she could get roughed up and possibly lose the baby. So instead, another member of the NAACP volunteered for the job, and her name was Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks worked a full day. She probably didn't sleep all that great the night before, honestly. I mean, you think about it, she is purposely going to get arrested in the Deep South and very likely, be handled very roughly. So on the day that this was set up, she got on the bus. She sat in the front seat. The bus driver said, "What are you doing? You have to sit in the back." And she says, "No, I'm not going to move." And so he called for police to come and arrest her just for sitting in the improper seat. When she was asked later why she chose to sit in the front seat and didn't move, she said, "I was tired," which is very likely. But the truth was, this was all about showing people, look, this is ridiculous. Look at how silly it is that people in the South feel the need to separate people according to color lines. So she was arrested. She was processed. And she did go to jail for this, just for sitting in the wrong seat. This totally goes against every kind of American freedom we can think of, to just get arrested for sitting in the wrong seat. Okay. A young Black minister, Martin Luther King Jr., stepped forward when he heard about Rosa Parks' arrest. And he helped to organize a boycott of the city bus system. Now, the majority of people who rode the bus were Black. This was inexpensive transportation, and people lived in one area of the city and they went to other areas of the city to work. And so they took the bus every day. When Black people no longer took the bus system discovered that they lost money. They lost a lot of money. It turns out that all of these Black riders on the bus were customers that should have been treated with respect and with care because they were customers. That's kind of how it works. So when they no longer treated their customers with respect, when their customers boycotted the system, the citizens basically broke that bus system. And so the bus company lost money. No Black citizens would ride the bus. But what ended up happening also is there were quite a few white citizens who would carpool and bring the black workers who worked for them to their area of town to give them a ride. In 1957, the Supreme Court ordered Montgomery to desegregate its bus system. Now, honestly, the Supreme Court shouldn't have been able to step in at this point. I mean, legally, of course they should be able to step in. But why? Why would they need to step in when the boycott worked? The idea that the bus system was going broke without their customers, honestly, they should have gone bankrupt so that they could make the decision themselves. Hey, we are going to treat all of our customers with respect. We really need to be very careful as a nation not to interfere federally when people can vote with their pockets, when they can vote with their money, when they can say, no, I disagree with this, so therefore I'm not going to put my money here. This, however, is going to spark the civil rights campaign because, again, we're going to see people looking and saying, hey, look, the Supreme Court's paying attention, and they're not issuing orders like Plessy versus Ferguson anymore. Now we're seeing issues like Brown versus the Brown versus Kansas, the Board of Education in Kansas. We're seeing the Supreme Court step in and actually upholding the law for Black Americans. So in that way, it was a good thing. Economically, it would have been better to let the bus companies go bankrupt. I know that sounds really harsh, but that's kind of what happens when people do not treat their customers with respect. Now, because the Supreme Court is ordering Montgomery, desegregate your buses, it's illegal, Martin Luther King's civil rights campaign spread nationwide, and people started looking at other ways that the people of the United States, the Black Americans, were not being treated with civil rights and not being treated equally. And instead of boycotting, they actually came in and just sat. Okay, this is called sit-ins. Now, some communities are going to refuse to obey the Supreme Court order to desegregate their schools. And honestly, these are some of the most embarrassing pictures from American history. We have always had issues with bullies. I get frustrated when people say, well, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, things were better. People were respectful to one another. No, they weren't. Okay, things have always been bad because of sin nature. And so when we look back to this period of time, how can you look back at this period of time and say back then people were nicer to each other? No, they weren't. They were just as cruel and just as mean as they are today. The thing is, this has to do with sin nature. This isn't about, respect in the home. We can have parents teach their children to be respectful of others, but the truth is, kids, I know that when you're at school, you act a little differently than you do at home. And some of the things you do would surprise your parents. That's not saying you're all bad. I don't think that for a second, but you're still trying to figure out who you are, and you're going to make mistakes along the way. It's just part of growing up. But keep that in mind when you have your own kids, that they're going to make mistakes and that they're going to have to be gently corrected. They're going to have to be gently disciplined to get on the right path. Discipline doesn't mean punishment. It means to walk with and show somebody how to do something. Really, probably many of the parents of these young people agreed with their behavior. It's unfortunate, but this is how many kids, especially in the South, were actually being raised to hate those of a different color. Now we look at this and go, wow, that is harsh. That's horrible. This is bullying. But this is how people were being taught. But not everybody. But looking at this picture, you can't tell whose parents told them, look, you treat everybody with respect, and whose parents said, you know what, you make it hard on those guys who are coming in. In 1957, a governor of Arkansas, Governor Orville E. Faubus, he ordered the Arkansas National Guard to bar Black students from Little Rock Central High School. This went directly against the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said you must desegregate your schools. So Little Rock's school system, the Black school system, chose 9 young people who were at the very top of their classes and had stellar recommendations for their character. These were great kids, not just good kids. These were great kids. And they were chosen specifically to go and be the very first students at an Arkansas public high school. The governor broke the law by sending the Arkansas National Guard, which were under his command because it was the state's National Guard, and he compelled them to go and prevent those students from desegregating the school, from entering classes. 9 students being blocked by the National Guard, by soldiers, from going into a classroom. When these students started walking in, again, really horrible, embarrassing pictures from American history, they were abused. They were called every name in the book. And look at this young lady in the front and center. This is hard for her to deal with. It is emotional for her, but she's trying to keep it together. Look at how she's dressed. She's dressed impeccably. She's got her neat little notebook. She's walking. She's no different than anybody else in this picture except for the color of her skin. The students around her are yelling, screaming, making crass and rude comments about her. And the National Guard is standing in the background letting it happen because they don't want to desegregate in their state. Unfortunately, you are also going to have to deal with, in American history, the idea that some churches, specifically churches in the South, were very anti what they called race mixing. We call it desegregation. They looked at this and they said, we should be completely separate from, white and black should be separate. They looked at this as, this one sign says Save Our Christian America. That has absolutely nothing to do with Christianity. I don't even know where they're trying to come up with that. The idea that race mixing is communism. No, it's not. Neither of these make any sense whatsoever. These are people's own ignorance showing. But it is unfortunate that this is a part of our history, and people will use Christianity as a weapon to get their way, and it's really sad. Christianity is not supposed to be a political entity. Now, Faubus, the Democratic governor of Little Rock, sending the National Guard to prevent these students from going into the school, was then stopped by President Eisenhower, who pulled rank. Eisenhower was a general during World War II. He actually led in the European theater, led multiple countries in the European theater, and he was not going to allow a governor of the United States to break the law that was set up by the Supreme Court. He pulled rank and he said, President overrules governor. You were told by the Supreme Court, a federal entity, that you had to desegregate. You chose not to. You sent out your National Guard. Well, I'm sending in paratroopers. Paratroopers are parachutists. Now, they didn't parachute in, which would have been really spectacular, but he sent, get this, 1,000 federal paratroopers to Little Rock to guard 9 black students. 9. 1,000 people to guard 9 black students as they entered the local high school. You notice there aren't any protesters out now. This was the President of the United States saying, we're not going to put up with this. We're not going to do this. Here are the Little Rock 9 and one of their teachers who helped them get ready for this opportunity. They all look sharp. What can you say? Martin Luther King Jr. helped form the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Martin Luther King Jr. was a pastor. He was the son of a pastor as well. This group, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, pledged itself to nonviolent resistance in their struggle for civil rights. Now, originally, he would have gotten his influence from Jesus himself as a Christian, as a pastor. But he also got a lot of practical um, protest ideas from Gandhi, who was an Indian leader who was helping to desegregate India after um, the British were in command of India for so long. The British ended up leaving in 1947, but part of that breaking of the color lines was done by Gandhi, who actually got his education in London. So he was using the laws of England against them to prove that they should leave and allow the Indian people to live peacefully on their own and with independence. So he used nonviolence for his struggle, and this is what Martin Luther King Jr. is going to do as well. He is going to nonviolently resist. He is simply going to walk or to sit or to speak, but he is not going to at all raise any kind of violence against those who are inflicting violence upon him or his people. So they planned marches and demonstrations to protest racial segregation, and they're going to use the media to get their message across, because when people see the nonviolent protesters being abused by the violent people who are supposed to be upholding the law, it's going to make a big difference in how America views the South. At the end of Eisenhower's second year, he served two four-year terms. The Republicans chose his vice president, Richard M. Nixon, to run against the Democratic candidate, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Now, Eisenhower, strong Republican president. Nixon, not a very strong vice president. In fact, somebody asked him once, what contribution did Nixon, give to to his executive office? And he said, if you give me a couple months, I might be able to think of one. There really wasn't a lot of love for Nixon, except for in California, because he was from California and he had served the people of California in a variety of offices, representing them to Washington, D.C. But the Republican Party is choosing Nixon because he has great name recognition. He had great facial recognition. Everybody recognized him from the news. People knew he was vice president. And it's a very common thing for a vice president to be running after the president they served has finished their term. It's a great way. It's kind of like riding on those coattails. So the Republican Party chose Vice President Richard Nixon. The Democrats went a little against type and they chose John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who was from New England. He spoke with a very thick New England accent. His father had gotten his wealth. He wasn't old money at all. He was nouveau riche, meaning new money. His father had gotten his money as work. Well, nobody really knows a whole lot about it, except for there is some evidence that he was into bootlegging during the Prohibition. His father was also very heavily invested in Hollywood for a long time. And his father had lots of money, but used that money under FDR to kind of build up his reputation as an honorable man. And he purchased the office of ambassador to England. So he got his foot in the door that way to prepare the way for his sons to be in politics and American leadership. And his oldest son was John F. Kennedy. He is going to be the next one to really make it in the family. Joe Kennedy, the father, is going to step back and let his sons take over. JFK was a senator, so he also had some recognition. His brothers are also going to get into politics, and so this is going to become a family that people are going to really be watching. Now, the biggest difference between these two men is going to be the most ridiculous reason why people are looking very closely at this race. They're going to be looking at the men's appearances. Sounds silly, but the truth is, people do vote for people to vote according to appearance, whether or not the politician is good looking or relatively good looking, because most politicians aren't really good looking. And when you put them side by side next to somebody who's really good looking, they're just kind of relative. When you look at Nixon in the top, he's not bad looking. He's just not great looking. And if you look at John F. Kennedy, he had that kind of bearing of like a male model of the time. And he was seen as being handsomer than Nixon. And that is going to come to play in their election. The other big thing is going to be television, again, because people are looking at how these men appear. There was a series of 4 televised debates. Nixon and Kennedy faced each other before the cameras while the nation watched. And as people watched this, they tended to like Kennedy more than Nixon because Kennedy looked more comfortable and more cool. He looked more relaxed in front of the cameras. Nixon tended to be a sweater. Not something you wear, but he sweated a lot. There was also one debate in which he got there a little late due to some traffic issues, and he was instructed to use this new product called Beard Be Gone, and it was really kind of a makeup that was put over the 5 o'clock shadow. Turns out that Nixon had a really heavy beard and he had to shave twice a day. Kind of an unusual thing for history, but it's an important part of history. So he used this new product called Beard Be Gone, which was a kind of cover-up for that beard. Well, he was already a sweater. He was under hot lights and he was mopping his face, and people noticed that his makeup was running and it did not look good for him. So he looked really uncomfortable in front of the camera. Kennedy appeared more energetic. He was youthful. He was relaxed. He was friendly. He was much more handsome than Nixon was. And many undecided voters, based on what they saw in these debates, they chose Kennedy because of his appearance. The people who listened to the same debate on the radio said Nixon won it hands down, Nixon won. People who were watching on television said, oh, Kennedy's good looking, I'm going to vote for him. That was their philosophy. So most people who listened to debates on radio said Nixon actually won the debates. Television had a greater impact. Since that time, those who have been hired to assist presidential candidates have looked back on these debates and they have taken notes based on how these men looked and acted, including the hairstyle. Yeah, the hair parted on the side and combed back. You will see that on almost every presidential candidate now. Of course, they've renamed it the Reagan, because in 1980, Ronald Reagan's hair became the standard by which all other politicians' hair was judged. But until then, we've got kind of the Kennedy going on here. Kennedy won the 1960 presidential election by 118,000 votes. That is not a lot of votes to win by. Now, your book says he won by 118,000 votes, and then in parentheses they put 303 to 219 electoral votes. Let's just clarify something. He didn't actually win by 118,000 votes because those votes don't really count. What counts is the 303 to 219 electoral votes. You see, people in the United States do not directly vote for their president. That is called the popular vote. We don't elect a president by popular vote. We elect a president by electors. In other words, we hire people who will then cast the vote for the president. We tell the electors this is what we want, and they in turn will throw their vote for whatever presidential elector or presidential candidate is winning, okay? According to the popular vote. Now, the electors are very important because they help to make sure that it's not just 1 or 2 states that get to choose the president. There is an excellent, I don't have it on here, but I can direct you to it. If you can go on PragerU, you can go on YouTube. You're already on YouTube, so I know you know how to use YouTube. You've probably used it long before my lectures. But go on YouTube to PragerU and type in Electoral College, and there is an excellent explanation of why the Electoral College is so incredibly important. Those who are very anti-electoral college tend to live in states with a high population because they want their state and its high population to actually guide and choose the presidents of the United States. The Electoral College makes sure that people from all across the United States have a voice and that their vote counts. The Electoral College's whole purpose is to make sure that everyone's vote counts in every state. So please watch that. It's really very informative. Okay. John F. Kennedy became the first Roman Catholic president of the United States. People might think, well, that's kind of unusual for a Democrat to be a Roman Catholic. If you go back into pre-Civil War era, the South had quite a few Roman Catholics in it. So that did make sense. There were quite a few Roman Catholic Democrats, and he is one of them. Now, what is going to be important about his faith and him being the president of the United States? He was very pro-family. In other words, he wanted he believed very strongly that children should be born and raised in their homes. He was not pro-abortion at all. He also believed in charity. He believed that was really important. He believed that people should be volunteering to help out. He made a statement during his inaugural address, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. In other words, people need to stop with the handouts, saying, please give me, give me, give me. Instead, you need to be offering your services to others. So those particular aspects of the Catholic religion were very important to his presidency. In 1959, communist dictator Fidel Castro took over control of Cuba by deceiving the Cuban people and believing that he would liberate the working class from the dictator Fulgencio Batista. Fulgencio Batista was a dictator. He had his issues, no doubt about it. But the people of Cuba were deceived into thinking that the solving of their problems would happen with socialism and communism. It's the same story that we hear over and over again in history, and people refuse to learn from it. So they don't like their leader. They don't like Fulgencio Batista. They're asking, what can we do to change this leadership? And then people start listening to this guy who had spent quite a lot of time outside of Cuba because he was actually banished for a while. This young man coming in, he was trained as a lawyer, so he understood how to speak. He understood how to present his case. And he said, look, what the people of Cuba really need is we need freedom, and we need to all work together. We need to take out the top tier of Cuban society so everybody gets a fair shake. Obviously, we need to work really hard to make sure that nobody has too much and that nobody has too little, so we need to share. And it's the same lies that socialism always tells. The truth is, people tend to do better even at the lowest level of society when capitalism is allowed to flourish, because the people in the lowest level of society have jobs to go to and they have money that they can make. They also have the opportunity to build their own businesses. Once he was in power, Castro admitted he was a communist. He wasn't just fooling around with the idea of socialism or anything like that. And he quickly set up his own dictatorship. So he told the people, I will help you get rid of this dictator. And then when he got into the leadership position, he set up his own dictatorship. So he basically traded one dictator for another himself. And he was helped in his goal of setting up this new communist dictatorship with his brother Raul, who is on the left-hand side of the picture at the bottom of your screen, and his friend that Raul and he met while they were banished in Mexico. They met this young communist who was from South America, and his name was Che Guevara. Che Guevara, firmly communist, And the three of them developed this idea to take over Cuba. And Che, even though he wasn't Cuban, became one of the people who was going to lead Cuba and as part of the Communist Party. Now, his job, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time on Che Guevara because a lot of people don't know who he is or what he was about. He was given the opportunity to be the treasurer of Cuba. The problem was Che Guevara hated money. He grew up with money. He grew up very, very wealthy. He was a very privileged young son of a doctor. So he grew up in a household where he was basically educated well in private schools. He himself did some medical training, but even though he grew up in a life of privilege, he hated his home and he hated his lifestyle. So he wanted to prove he was one of the people. And so he gave all that up. And when he was made treasurer of the Cubans, he mocked the job. He didn't really see much point in being, a treasurer. So he signed the money, which was pretty much worthless because it was just being printed, with his nickname Che, it was a habit of his to say, or right, or eh. Okay, so when he would say something, he would end it with Che, like, you get it, you understand, right? And so he would sign the money with his nickname. He also was in charge of creating the execution squads, putting people into concentration camps. Yes, they were doing all that. When a person was caught saying things that were negative about the new government, they could be put into a camp or they could be lined up against a wall and shot. And he was responsible for the death of several thousand people in Cuba. Now, put that into context with today, where on a lot of college campuses, you'll see students wearing t-shirts with this man's picture on them, Che Guevara, and they will say he was a revolutionary, he was a freedom fighter, he was a murderer. Was he a revolutionary? Yes, he was a communist revolutionary. Was he a freedom fighter? No. He was a liar. He told the people of Cuba he was helping to free them from a dictatorship, and then he helped set up a dictatorship. When his time was over in Cuba, he's going to try to set up another dictatorship in his homeland, and that's not going to work out well for him. But just remember Che Guevara because he's going to play a very important part in Cuban politics. Okay, in April 1961, the Cubans who had fled from Cuba because of this new communist dictatorship, they had gotten permission from the United States government to come and live in the United States, where they were trained how to fight, because they were eventually going to go back to Cuba and they were going to take it back over from this communist dictator and his two buddies. So they were looking to get rid of Che Guevara and Raul Castro and, of course, Fidel Castro, who was the ultimate leader. Now, these men were trained under the time of Eisenhower, who was trying to help them get their own country back. The United States was not going to participate except for training these men, and then they were supposed to get air cover for when they did actually invade their own homeland again and wipe out the communist dictators. So in April 1961, an American-trained force of Cuban freedom fighters invaded Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, but by this time the president had changed. It went from Eisenhower to Kennedy. President Kennedy promised he would follow the plan, and he promised to give the brave men American air cover and support. So here are Cubans who were American trained, who were American armed, going back to their homeland to get their country back from the Cuban dictator. They had lost thousands of family members. I mean, lots of people died because of Fidel Castro, and these men were trying to get rid of Fidel Castro and bring Cuba back to a place of freedom. So President Kennedy promised to give these brave men American air cover and support. But at the last minute, he backed away from his promise. That was a huge mistake for Kennedy because the American people turned on him and said, what in the world are you doing? We promised air support and we didn't give it. And as a result of our president not backing the Cuban, I don't know what you'd call them, Cuban soldiers, the invasion failed. These men were captured. Many of them were killed. Kennedy lost his public support at that point. People were really angry at him for doing this because they saw this as a betrayal. Here were men who were looking to free their home country, not overthrow everybody in the nation and set up their own dictatorship, but to overthrow the dictator who had taken over. And the United States didn't back them up. And it made the rest of the United States, the people, feel like we had been part of that betrayal, and we didn't like that. Conservatives became concerned about Cuba because it's only 90 miles from Florida. That's it. And it was very easy to use Cuba as a launching pad for communist attacks on America. This was a real concern. Communism was a big concern during the 1950s and 60s because it existed. It wasn't just a scare, and it wasn't paranoia. It really was an issue. It was discovered over and over again, these little pockets of communists who were trying to overthrow the United States. Now they're not really hiding so much. They're just out in force teaching in college campuses and on the streets under different names. But yeah, they firmly believe that communism and socialism is a good thing, and they're very open about how they feel about it. But here we have conservatives becoming very concerned about the fact that Cuba is a communist nation. They are allied with Russia, our biggest enemy at the time, and it would be the easiest thing in the world for Russia to use Cuba as a base to launch attacks. Now, remember I told you to remember Che Guevara? That's him in the corner. Sorry, REM reference there. That is him. This is the picture that was taken by a newspaper or a news magazine. And this picture became an iconic photo of revolutionaries. This is the one that's on everybody's t-shirts. Now, he would not have agreed with having his picture put on a t-shirt and then sold for $20-25 because that's capitalism, and he was anti-capitalism. But he was one of these leaders in Cuba. Now, why is he coming up right now? Because he actually arranged for missiles and missile sites to be built in Cuba that would be perfect for launching pads into the United States. His goal was to take out everything on the East Coast and march right up to Washington, D.C. and take over the United States and make it a communist nation. This isn't paranoia. They actually built the missile sites. The missiles belonged to Russia, but the sites were arranged by Che Guevara under the guidance and the leadership of Fidel Castro. So this is a real thing. People who like to rewrite history tend to forget about this part of history. They want to say, oh, the United States, people were so paranoid in the 50s about communism. This isn't paranoia. This is black and white in your face. Now, after the failure at the Bay of Pigs, the Soviet leader decided to renew his threats to invade West Berlin. Our president showed he was weak. So he's like, well, if you won't help Cubans take over their own nation, you're definitely not going to help Berliners take over, prevent us from attacking the West, because East Berlin was actually owned by the Soviets at the time. West Berlin was free. Kennedy, at that point, had to grow a backbone and say, hey, the United States will use armed force to keep West Berlin out free from communism. If you try to invade West Berlin, we will stand up for the people of West Berlin. I think he learned his lesson from the Bay of Pigs debacle. Okay, West Berlin was a sore spot for the Soviets. Over 4,000 East Germans per week were escaping to freedom in West Berlin. This made communism look bad in the eyes of the world. Communism does look bad in the eyes of the world when people actually see communism. But communism is also really good about lying about how effective it is. It will lie to people and say, look, we are rich, we're doing great, everything's good. And then you meet people from communist countries and they're like, psh, I don't want to see that here. When socialists in our country today say that we need democratic socialism, it's really interesting when people from socialist countries are interviewed as in man on the street interviews and asked, how do you feel about socialism? And they will tell them flat out, it is a horrible, horrible thing. We don't want to have anything to do with socialism. We escape socialism, but yet people who have been living in capitalism their whole lives see it as a good thing because they don't understand how good they really have it. The economy of East Germany could not lose any more skilled workers to the West. The people who were the most talented were the ones who figured out how to get out of East Germany and escape into West Germany. And often West German guards would help people get over or through the fences. This is barbed wire fence at this point. On August 13th, 1961, the communists solved the problem of people escaping into East Germany by putting a barbed wire fence between East and West Berlin. That was the plan at first, but people can still get through barbed wire. Growing up, I lived in a desert area, and if you had to cross into, from one place to another, you often, crawled through barbed wire. It's not that hard to get through. You just have to have someone there to hold it up for you. Okay, later, there was a solid cement block wall that arose. It was called the Berlin Wall because it separated East Berlin from West Berlin. And that became a grand monument to the failure of communism. Why is it a failure? Because it's the first wall ever in history that was built to keep citizens in. Every other wall has been built for the defense of its citizens, to keep enemies out or to keep others out. It was to protect the citizenry. That's the biggest difference between the Berlin Wall and every other wall that's been built in history. The other walls do work, by the way. The Berlin Wall did work. Did people escape? Yes, they still did, even with the Berlin Wall, but it was down to a trickle, just a few a year. On June 1963, this is after Khrushchev started making noise like he was going to invade West Berlin. JFK visited West Berlin, and he personally assured the people that the United States would protect them from communist aggression. Now, there is a little silly story that kind of goes along with this. He made a statement, "Ich bin Berliner." He said, "I am from Berlin." What he was saying was not that he was literally from Berlin, but that everybody in the West viewed the Berlin people as brothers and sisters, that we were all people from Berlin trying to escape or trying to prevent communism from taking over. And so when he said that, "I am a Berliner," people were like, in the crowd were going, "Oh, okay, we understand what you're trying to say, and we're going to be very forgiving of that." The newspapers, on the other hand, are never very forgiving. They're not. So they made fun of him because what he actually said is, "I am a jelly-filled donut." Berliner was a type of donut. So it's one of those interesting little parts of history. On October 1962, the president ordered a naval blockade around Cuba to keep the Soviet Union from shipping missiles and nuclear warheads to the island because, again, Cuba is only 90 miles from Florida. So the news came out that the Russians were looking to set up these bases. The bases were already there, these missile sites. And now it was all about, are they going to be able to ship missiles and, even more importantly, nuclear warheads to the island? Because it wouldn't take much for a nuclear warhead to get over into the United States and to cause incredible destruction. Now, when the news came out that Russia was actually supplying warheads and missiles to Cuba, the people of the United States became very panicked. Why wouldn't we? Of course we're going to get panicked by this news that Russia is looking to use Cuba as a base to shoot nuclear warheads at us. That's major. So to keep the panic down, the U.S. government provided some guidelines specifically for people to follow so that they wouldn't be harmed by nuclear power. They were completely ridiculous and completely false, but it gave people a sense of, well, false peace. It was called the duck and cover. And people were told that if they heard the alarms or they could see, like a mushroom cloud, if the bomb had been dropped, if a missile had been fired, if a nuclear warhead went off, they should drop to the ground, curl into a ball, and cover their heads. That's it. That is not going to prevent any part of a nuclear attack on you. You'll just disintegrate if you're really close. In Nagasaki and Hiroshima, there are shadows left behind from where people were completely evaporated, and the only thing left was their ash. So it was terrifying to think that this is really what's being taught. In schools, kids had duck and cover drills where they would get under their desks in case of a nuclear attack. This was something that was being taught, and the government was trying to give people a practical solution for something that it's not going to work at all, but they were trying to give them something to do. Now, some people, they took that and they said, that's not going to help anything. So one of the biggest businesses that kind of boomed at this time was underground shelters. So people would pay to have an underground shelter put in their backyard, and they would stock it, and they had bomb shelters. That became a thing. Of course, not everybody can have that. It was expensive. And of course, most, if people live in apartments, it's not going to happen anyway. But bomb shelters, duck and cover, this became part of the landscape in the early 1960s. So at first, Soviet leader Khrushchev refused to back down. He said, I'm going to send missiles there anyway. We have the right to defend ourselves. He's not trying to defend anything with missiles aimed at the United States. And President Kennedy refuses to back down. So this missile crisis that lasted for 14 days, 2 weeks is a long time. You'll realize that now that you're in quarantine. 2 weeks is a long time. This missile crisis had the entire world on the brink of nuclear war. It only took one person kind of losing control before this could spark an entire war, a world war. You have Khrushchev in Russia saying, I'm going to keep sending missiles if I want to. I have that right. You're going to have JFK saying, nuh-uh, because you're 14 miles or you're 90 miles off our coast. There is no way we're going to allow that. I'm going to send out a military blockade. We're going to prevent you from delivering missiles. And then you have Castro, who's the leader of Cuba, where these are set, where the missiles are already set. And you have Che Guevara, who's like, let's shoot them off. Let's do this. Let's start this war. You have these three leaders who are all just trying to hold back to see who's going to actually move first. And of course, Che Guevara is in the background going, let's just start it. Let's do this. Okay. Kennedy remained very firm. He got stronger as a president. The United States, thanks to military planning and economic prosperity, had a clear weapons advantage over the Soviet Union. Even with all the SALT II treaties and everything else, we had other weapons that we had been developing during that time. And we had a clear advantage over the Soviet Union. So it got to the point where it's just a matter of playing chicken. Who's going to go first? 14 days, and people were on the edge of their seats wondering if they would even have a tomorrow. We have forgotten about this. As a nation, we have forgotten about the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was 14 days of sheer terror for the people of the United States. Now, I was in a church service where somebody said, 50 years ago, things were so much better than they are today. And just on a lark, I looked up the date for 50 years ago from that time the person was speaking. And it was during the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I thought, I would bet you money, if I was a betting woman, that people who were living 50 years ago were saying, man, you remember 50 years ago when it was so much better? But that would have also been a misnomer because that would have put them right in the middle of World War One. It's never been better, guys. Okay, there are aspects that have been good and aspects that have been bad, but it's never been a paradise on earth since creation. Okay, we had creation and then the fall. As soon as the fall hit, it's never been better. So we can go back and try to look and say, oh, remember back when? That is sentiment. We look backwards with these, what they call rose-colored glasses. Everything is in the light of, I have great memories from back in the day, so I'm going to remember the good stuff. And we tend to forget the bad stuff, which is why we take history classes, so that we don't keep repeating the same stupid mistakes. Okay, we learn from them. So here we have two men who are both with their finger on the button, ready to go, and both trying desperately to get the other person to cave in and to come to an agreement that they're not going to start a nuclear holocaust. Now, just for a little bit of pop culture reference here, this does make it into an entire episode of Call the Midwife, where everybody in the cast, the characters are all very concerned that they may be in their last 14 days of life, that this problem between Russia and the US might start a nuclear war that will go worldwide. Now, communists were forced to stop sending nuclear weapons. That was because of the blockade. They were also forced to remove nuclear weapons. That was the agreement that Khrushchev actually came to with the United States. So they had to remove nuclear weapons that were already in Cuba. They already had nuclear weapons in Cuba. In return, Kennedy made a promise to Cuba, specifically to Fidel Castro, that no American president would ever invade Cuba and deliver it from communist control. We will allow the communists to take over Cuba. We will never try to stop communism in Cuba. You just have to get rid of your nuclear weapons. Now, Che Guevara hears this and he's like, no. Are you kidding me? Push the button. Send the nuclear weapons. Destroy the United States. Let's take over that horrible place where people can actually make money and buy houses and make it a communist nation. That was Che Guevara's goal. Fidel Castro, however, saw this and said, this is a really great way for me to solidify my dictatorship in Cuba. All I have to say is I'm going to send back the nuclear weapons, and the United States, who's only 90 miles off my coast, will not come in and threaten my dictatorship. And so Fidel Castro agreed, and Che Guevara was furious. Furious. It was right after that Fidel Castro said to Che Guevara, you've done great work here, but I think it's time for you to move on. And he did. He went back to his homeland and immediately began to try to overthrow the government there so he could set up his own communist dictatorship. Okay, in 1963, both the United States and the USSR installed a hotline providing instant communication between the two countries. It was often called the red phone, and for a while it was the red phone. It was carried wherever the president went. They also call it the football because there's a phone inside of a briefcase that has nuclear warhead codes in it, and that follows the president everywhere he goes. Oops, sorry, went backwards. There we go. In 1961, President Kennedy established a government program known as the Peace Corps. In a time when war is that quick, can happen at any time in 14 days, the Peace Corps was to bring people together by doing charity work for other nations. So the Peace Corps sent volunteers out to improve the health and farming practices of poor rural villages around the world. So he sent American workers around the world to help people in the poorest nations. Peace Corps still around, by the way. President Kennedy also established an alliance for progress that followed up on FDR's Good Neighbor policy. So this was throughout South America. Good Neighbor policy where money would be granted, businesses would be set up with government help in other countries. The United States sent several $billions on the program, but the progress is really slow because there were other problems that were going on in South American and Central American countries that were more spiritual in problem than economic and political. The spiritual problems were played out in economic and political issues, but the spiritual aspect of it was number one, and it really had to do with forsaking God and looking to men as the reason for ability for making progress. They really dismissed the ideas of God and of the Bible and instead looked to themselves to solve their problems. And their way of solving problems was they really were following a lot of socialist and communist teachings at the time that you have to get rid of the wealthy or at least tax them a fair amount, a lot of money, with the exception of those who are actually in government. They were allowed to be as wealthy as they could be. And then, give a little bit of money here and there to the poorest people to make them feel like the government was helping to take care of them. The civil rights movement was known for its varied methods of protest against segregation, and we're bringing it up again because this is a new part of the civil rights movement during Kennedy's time. Okay, so they had varied methods of protest against segregation. They started out with equal right marches. Again, Martin Luther King Jr. helped to start those. Remember also the boycott in Montgomery. Black college students began to stage sit-ins, which were completely nonviolent. They would go to lunch counters back in the day. Hard to believe this, but if you went to a drugstore like Walgreens or Rite Aid, they would have a lunch counter or, like a soda shop set up in the middle of the drugstore. And you could go in and you could sit down, have a hamburger, go pick up some aspirin, eat a hamburger, drink a soda. And the sodas were all mixed for you. It wasn't just like always a bottle of Coke. But these lunch counters in these drugstores were reserved for whites. If you were a black person, remember when we watched Jackie Robinson, he went into a cafe that wasn't very crowded and he says, I've got 18 men outside on a bus. Can we come in and eat? Now, usually you don't have to ask that at a restaurant, but because Jackie Robinson and the men on the bus were black and this was a white establishment, they basically weren't allowed to sit down and eat at the restaurant. These lunch counters were reserved for whites. If a black person could go in and order a sandwich, but they had to get it to go. They couldn't eat at the lunch counter. So college students were saying, we need to stop this. We need to break this. And so instead of boycotting the restaurants, because honestly, they wouldn't be there in the first place, so boycotting wouldn't make a difference. It was all white customers. Instead, they sat in those chairs knowing that they would not be served because they were black, but they took up every seat so that white people could not go and get their sandwiches and eat at the counter either. So black shoppers would not spend their money in those stores. They just refused to go in. And black students would be sitting at the counters, just sitting, not doing anything mean, just sitting. That doesn't mean it was easy for them, because in some cases, black students and white students who were supporting them would be abused. Food would get ordered and then milkshakes poured over people's heads. People would get punched. They would get pinched. It's just a very difficult part of American history. And it was not that long ago. This is the kind of thing we need to remember so that we don't ever, ever, ever get involved in this again. If you disagree with somebody and you're with a group of people who all disagree with that person, and your instinct is to incite violence, to throw a rock, to break a window, to shoot a gun, you're on the wrong side. It's that simple. If you are looking to inflict violence on someone else, you are on the wrong side of history. Period. if you are in the streets with crowbars, wearing masks, well, everybody's wearing a mask now, wearing all black masks, helmets, and you're running around hitting people with bats and crowbars and saying you're doing it because you disagree with police brutality, you're on the wrong side. You don't protest against brutality with violence. No. By 1963, stores figured it out. They were losing money. So they stopped the segregation. Lunch counters, theaters, hotels were all desegregated. It didn't matter what color you were. You could go and get a soda and a burger, go watch a movie. You could go stay at a hotel. All of those were desegregated by 1963. Now, there was still segregation at bus stations. That was the Plessy versus Ferguson thing, was still around. So many black and white college students took freedom rides throughout the South just to break that segregation policy. Now, the Attorney General of the United States is going to watch what's going on, and he's going to say, you know what? We can prove, or we can say that the federal government can step in at this point and say, you cannot have segregated bus stations because the routes that the buses take are federal. They're on federal highways. So if a bus is taking a federal highway, they cannot be segregated. That's how they got around that. Unfortunately, people, again, were violent. So they threw firecrackers or smoke bombs or pipe bombs into buses that were being desegregated. Didn't care who they killed, didn't care who they hurt. All they cared about was their political point of view. And they're on the wrong side of history because of their violence. Upon their arrival at bus stations, freedom riders refused to obey signs for segregated toilets, water fountains, and waiting rooms. They were there to break those lines and to say, look at what's going on. Why are we following this antiquated, never fair law? Not even a law, just, well, Plessy versus Ferguson, yes. But we need to change that law. And this is their way of making people aware that this was still going on. Here we are. 1961, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy ordered the Interstate Commerce Commission to ban segregation in any facilities used by interstate buses. So that is what ended up breaking that segregation that Plessy versus Ferguson had set up in the first place. You notice the name of the Attorney General is very similar to the president's. The president is John F. Kennedy, and the Attorney General is Robert F. Kennedy. That's because they were brothers. In the fall of 1962, a black student named James Meredith attempted to enroll at the all-white University of Mississippi. Because it is the University of Mississippi, it is a state university, which means it is public. You should be allowed to attend that university if you can pay for it, and you are a citizen of Mississippi, or you pay a little bit more if you're from out of state. President Kennedy said, this guy has the creds, he has the money, and he has the grades to get into the school. He sent 5,000 troops to campus, enabling him to register as a student. This is going to just drive the South crazy, because this was exactly what they had protested with the previous president, with Eisenhower. They looked at Eisenhower and said, Eisenhower, a Republican, is forcing us to put black students in our public schools. So that's it. We're going to get him out of here. Of course, Eisenhower served his 2 terms, but they didn't vote for Nixon because he's another Republican. They voted for a Democrat, and what do you know what happens? A Democrat steps in and says, we are going to stop this racial segregation. And so for the first time, we're really seeing Democrats stepping forward and saying, we are going to push the idea of civil rights. John F. Kennedy is enabling this man to register as a student, James Meredith. And he's sending troops just like his Republican predecessor had. He did get shot in the leg, James Meredith, and he recovered, and became famous as a civil rights activist. The most dramatic moment of the civil rights movement came in 1963. Martin Luther King Jr. addressed 200,000 people from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Sound familiar? It should. We just talked about Marian Anderson singing from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Martin Luther King Jr. called for an end to discrimination. He basically, and I want you to go on YouTube. You've got a couple of things to look up on YouTube. I want you to go on YouTube and I want you to look for his I Had a Dream speech. I tried to put it into the show, but it wouldn't allow me because it wasn't available for public viewing. It's copyrighted. I'm wondering now if maybe the Marian Anderson thing was too. Maybe it was deleted for me. So I'm starting to wonder about that. But he called for an end to discrimination and gave a really heartfelt testimony about what it felt like to be a father in the United States and having to tell your children, we can't go to certain places because of our skin color. And he says, I have a dream that one day my children will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. The skin color shouldn't make a difference. Let's look at who we are, how we act, how we treat others. That's what it should be. He declared, oh, there it is. I have a dream that included his own children would be judged by the content of their character rather than the color of the skin. So please take some time and look that up on YouTube. It's a very powerful speech. Really great speech. So that was a couple things you need to look up. And that brings us to the end. That was the rest, that missing lecture. I really don't know what happened to it. I don't know if it was, it's probably my mistake. I'll just own it that it was my mistake. I don't know why it happened, but it did. So go ahead and watch that and fill in your notes. And I will be doing another lecture later today that will be more current for, actually, we're going to be reading some Having Our Say today in class. And we'll get to that a little bit later. Have a really good rest of the day.